Microbial consortia. So what is microbial consortia? This term was coined by Johannes Reinke in 1872. Consortium is in a singular. Consortia is plural. Consortia is a group of organisms living together without interfering with each other to meet their goals. So consortium can be endosymbiotic. In endosymbiotic, organism lives within host body, so mostly mutualistic relationship. In ectosymbiotic, organism lives on host body surface, and then the parasitic relationship. In the next video, this will show you on how consortium formed.
Organisms show up in the background of other organisms' lives, providing pops of color among debris. And if you're thinking about identifying what this is, you might turn to some of the obvious candidates, maybe a euglenoid or some kind of algae, something green and rod-shaped and single-celled, possibly eukaryotic. And if that's your guess, we would not blame you, but you are wrong. What you are looking at is not a single-celled organism, but rather a gathering of them. Those green bits are consortia of bacteria. We're going to explain more about what is actually in that consortia, but before that, we got to tell you what a consortium is. First, not all consortia are green. Some are more like the colorless squiggle you see in the middle of your screen, made up of thin, curved prokaryotes gathering around a central bacterium that has flagella at both ends. And consortium is kind of a funny word to describe bacteria, isn't it? It makes them sound like a group of companies that have come together to sign some fancy legal document, which I suppose in a way they have. There isn't a legal document binding them together. There is simply survival. The word consortium can mean a lot of things in the microbial world, in part because our understanding of what they are is currently evolving. But also, there are just a lot of different contexts in which they seem to appear. When the term was first introduced to the microcosmos realm in 1872 by naturalist Johannes Reinke, the idea was to describe how an organism can actually be made up of two species that have somehow found a unified body to live in. Organisms like lichen, made up of algae and fungi. But the specific ways that organisms intertwine their lives can vary, and for our purposes today, the definition that probably best applies is that a consortium is a group of bacteria that are organized and are in permanent contact with one another. There are various types of consortia that scientists know about, including formations that live in your own mouth. These consortia can be distinguished from one another by their color and their shape, the number of cells within them, and the shape of those cells. And what makes them all special is that these are relationships formed entirely between prokaryotes. This sets consortia apart from other ventures into bacterial symbiosis that we have explored, which have generally involved bacteria seeking out more complex eukaryotic partners. For example, there are bacteria that live on the surface of the ciliate Kentrophorus so they can hitch a ride to regions with enough hydrogen sulfide for them to convert into food. So this property of consortia only being relationships between prokaryotes makes this really fascinating to scientists for a few reasons. One is simply that bacteria probably teamed up with each other before they ever teamed up with eukaryotes, and understanding how they formed these relationships may help us better grasp how they have evolved with the world around them. Consortia offer more than just history, though. They also might suggest different futures for us, providing us with the means to understand how we can use bacteria for everything from farming to cleaning up oil spills. But identifying and understanding these consortia is challenging. James, our master of microscopes, has been baffled by what looks like a bunch of logs glued together. He thought there might be flagellates in there along with the prokaryotes, but when he tried separating the individuals, he couldn't find any. So for now, Like most of the consortia we've been looking at, the mechanics of this group remain unclear to us. Perhaps the best studied consortium is Chlorochromatium aggregatum, the small green group we watched in the beginning of this episode. They are found in lakes and ponds, typically in areas with low amounts of oxygen and light. The green bacteria are Chlorobium chlorochromatii, a green sulfur bacteria that are photosynthetic but that are surprisingly adept at living in low-light situations. And yet, they do still need light, which would be fine, except that green sulfur bacteria have a problem. They cannot swim. There are ways around this problem, like the green sulfur bacteria that just go up in the water column by producing gas vacuoles. It's like balloon travel in the microcosmos, and much like actual balloon.
So what is microplastic? So all you need to know is for UPSC CCE. So the new researchers at the Indian Institute of Science, or IISC, have developed a sustainable hydrogel to combat the threat posed by microplastic in water. So what will this post teach? So they teach IISC's hydrogel and microplastic. So what is IIC's hydrogel? So the mechanism, it utilizes a unique intertwined polymer network capable of binding and degrading contaminants upon UV light irradiation. It comprises three polymer layers, which are chitosan, polyvinyl alcohol, and polyaniline, intertwined to form an interpenetrating polymer network, or IPN architecture. Microplastics. So plastics particles lesser than 5 mm in diameter. Plastic pollution that ends up in the ocean deteriorates and breaks down and ends up as a microplastics. So these are the classification of microplastics. We have two classification, which is the primary and the secondary microplastics. In primary, tiny particles designed for commercial use and microfibers shed from clothing and other textiles. And on the secondary plastics, form from the breakdown of larger plastics such as water bottles. Menace of microplastics. They end up in the oceans over every year and make up about 80% of all marine debris. The most visible and disturbing impacts include suffocation and entanglement of hundreds of marine species. Humans consume these marine animals as seafood, which leads to several health complications. On to the next video, it explains how microplastics works.
Our world today, the one that we have constructed, feels as if it runs on plastic. It is a building block in our bags, our bottles, clothing, toys, the list. It goes on and on. Plastic has become so prevalent that it is, for all intents and purposes, impossible to escape. Even in the microcosmos, plastic is inevitable. It persists in long, still threads that could have come from anything. Maybe it was shed from a piece of clothing, or it came off of a car part. Whatever it once was, this shred of microplastic is one of many pieces just like it, turning the microcosmos into a burial ground for our waste. But microbes are crafty. They're capable of making lives out of the most unusual ingredients, including plastic. So what does that look like for them, and also for us? Well, first let's be human about it and focus on ourselves for a bit, and particularly our love for plastics. We currently make around 400 million tons of plastic every year. But why? Well, plastics covers a wide range of materials. At a chemical level, they are made of structures that repeat over and over, creating a pattern that builds into a material that is moldable under the right temperatures and pressures. And nature is full of materials like this that would end up driving our love of plastics, including natural rubber and plant cellulose. Even wood is a chemical polymer. But nature sets some constraints on how much we can take and what precisely is available. And at the turn of the 20th century, the advances of chemistry and the demands of war meant that synthetic plastic was primed to take over, first as part of military vehicles and parachutes and other wartime needs, and then after in consumer goods like Tupperware. They were cheaper and lighter than glass and metal and so versatile. But while we've lived with the benefits of these synthetic plastics for more than a century now, we are also living with their harms. Plastics don't just surround us in the objects we make, they last in these invisible forms, smaller than 5 millimeters in length. Some might come off our clothes when we wash them, others might be part of our cosmetics. They can loft into the air and come back down with the rain, or they can travel through our waterways, ending up in ponds and oceans. James, our master of microscopes, found most of the samples we're looking at today floating in his plankton net while gathering microbe samples. And on their own, these small fragments of plastic seem so inconsequential. But in a world like ours, where everything is connected, nothing is inconsequential. Microplastics get eaten by animals. They break down into chemicals that can be toxic, and those get leached into the environment. But the consequences do not stop there. Animals get eaten by other animals, which then get eaten by other animals, and so on. And with each step up and around the food web, microplastics and their toxins accumulate. Scientists are still working to understand how microplastics affect our ecosystems and our bodies. But one of the challenges with microplastics is just how durable they are. Those long chains of atoms, once assembled, tend to stay that way. One way to curb the amount of microplastics that end up in our world and in us is to stop making as much new plastic and instead, recycle what we've already made. Unfortunately, only a very small fraction of the massive amount of plastic we produce each year gets recycled. Some of the challenges are our infrastructure, like figuring out how to sort different types of plastics so they can be properly recycled without mixing them up with each other. Some of it is technological, finding ways to break down the most challenging plastics or developing tools to ensure each recycled plastic is just as good as the original. And that has led scientists to turn to the microcosmos for possible answers, with one particular question in mind: can microbes eat plastic? And there are many ways to investigate that question, and for Maria Pinto, a scientist who has sent us samples before, it's taken her out into the ocean as she looks to see how bacteria gather on plastics. The samples come from all over. Some are from the Atlantic Ocean, some from the Pacific, some from the Adriatic Sea. The ubiquity of microplastics in her samples feels similar to the way we find microbes everywhere, but without the wonder and awe that microbes inspire. Now, microbes are everywhere because they find a way to endure, adapt, and spread. Their ubiquity is a marker of their ingenuity. Microplastics, on the other hand, are a product of our ingenuity, but also our carelessness with our creations. It also fits that these two pervasive entities would find each other. Maria has seen the bacteria gathering on microplastics, their cellular bodies producing enzymes that might even be able to break down the plastics into their individual units for the bacteria to use. Scientists are looking plenty of other places too. Greek beaches, mud near a Japanese plastic recycling factory, hot springs in Yellowstone National Park. These Diverse iterations of the microcosmos and the plastic-eating bacteria in them teach us more about the enzymes we might be able to use in the future to recycle plastic. These enzymes come with their own challenges. Some work in a narrow temperature range, others are just kind of slow. But the more scientists learn about how these enzymes work, the more they're able to improve them, sometimes even combining different enzymes to make one super plastic digesting enzyme. This is all necessary research, urgent against the backdrop of every other way our planet has been affected by human behavior. We are still only just beginning to understand how widespread this evolution around plastics is, and how organisms have managed to develop mechanisms around seemingly unnatural materials that we've overwhelmed nature with. In 2020, we knew of about 90 microbes capable of digesting plastic. Those scientists are still trying to understand whether all of those microbes consume the parts we want them to. And more research searching for signs of plastic digesting enzymes found a correlation between the abundance of those enzymes and the extent of plastic pollution in a given area. Perhaps, if we understand more about how microbes are adapting to this pollution, we'll understand better how we can use them. But what does it mean to rely on our oldest, smallest creatures to fix our newest, biggest problems? A bacterium can eat away at plastic, but what comes after? When you think of the scale of what bacteria have done in the past, it seems possible for them to fix things for us. They've reshaped atmospheres and constructed ecosystems. What's a little plastic to them? But for all bacteria can do, they cannot run our business, nor can they command our infrastructure or curb our demands. Bacteria are not going to be our saviors. They are simply our neighbors, along with everything else on Earth. So to make the best use of them requires more than just understanding how they work. It requires understanding ourselves and how we work. Anything else, and it may not matter what we find.